ഹായ് ഫ്രണ്ട്സ്, എൻ്റെ ഈ ടോപ്പിക് വന്നിട്ട് ടി.എസ്. ഈലിയറ്റ് എഴുതിയ ട്രഡീഷൻ ആൻഡ് ഇൻഡിവിജ്വൽ ടാലൻറ്റ് എന്നുള്ള ഒരു ക്രിറ്റിസിസത്തിൻ്റെ ഒരു സമ്മറിയാണ്. അപ്പോൾ എക്സാമിന് ഇപ്പോൾ പ്രിപ്പയർ ചെയ്തിട്ടിരിക്കുന്ന സ്റ്റുഡൻസൊക്കെ ഈ ഒരു സമ്മറി നന്നായി പഠിച്ചെഴുതിയാൽ തന്നെ നല്ല സ്കോർ കിട്ടും. പോരാതെ ഇത് പഠിക്കാൻ വന്നിട്ട് നല്ല എളുപ്പമാണ്. അപ്പോൾ എന്താണോ നിങ്ങൾ എക്സാമിന് എഴുതേണ്ടത് അതങ്ങനെ ഞാനിപ്പോൾ ഇതിൽ ഒന്ന് വായിച്ചു വിടുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ ഇതൊന്ന് സ്ക്രീൻഷോട്ട് എടുത്തിട്ട് ഇതിൻ്റെ നോട്ട് നിങ്ങൾ എഴുതിയെടുത്താൽ മതി. ഓക്കെ, അപ്പോൾ എന്ത് ചോദിച്ചാലും ടി.എസ്. ഈലിയറ്റിൻ്റെ ട്രഡീഷണൽ ആൻഡ് ഇൻഡിവിജ്വൽ ടാലൻറ്റ് എന്നുള്ള എസ്സേന്ന് എന്ത് രീതിയിൽ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ ചോദിച്ചാലും ഇതാണ് നിങ്ങളുടെ ആൻസർ. അപ്പോൾ അതൊന്ന് എക്സ്പ്ലെയിൻ ചെയ്യാണ്. എക്സ്പ്ലെയിൻ പറഞ്ഞു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഇതിലുള്ളത് നല്ല എക്സ്പ്ലെയിൻഡ് ആണ്. ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ കുറച്ച് ഏറ്റവും സിമ്പിൾ ഇംഗ്ലീഷാണ് യൂസ് ചെയ്തിരിക്കുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ ഇതൊന്ന് വായിച്ചു വിടാം. അപ്പോൾ ഇതങ്ങനെ നിങ്ങൾ എഴുതിയാൽ മതി. ഓക്കെ, ടി.എസ്. ഈലിയറ്റ് ആസ് എ ക്രിട്ടിക്. Eliot is considered the most famous critic of the 20th century. He was a poet himself. His critical work has additional value. His own theory was the only a poet could be a critic of poetry. His mind was comprehensive. He was specially concerned with values and the very survival of culture and civilization. Religion was important to him. His position was that literary standards, though important, were not enough. Religious values are also essential to access the greatness of literature. He reacted against romanticism and pure non-religious humanism. He chose to be a classicist in art and criticism. Eliot evolved his own theory of literature, which he presented in his critical essays. The prevailing tendency in criticism at the same time of Eliot was Impressionism and abstract criticism. The Impressionist critics was only concerned with the individual's response to a work of art and recording it in words. Such a method became a mere expression of the critic. The abstract school sought social and philosophical values in a work of art, and the emotional aspect was eliminated. Such a criticism became a form of intellectual activity, creating a gulf between intellect and feeling. Both these schools imported much irrelevant material into criticism. True criticism, according to Eliot, was the expression of perception formed in a really appreciative mind. It was neither feeling nor mere thought, but a synthetic of both. Eliot maintained that a critic of poetry must bear in mind the following points. He must have a general idea of nature of poetry. A poem is a living whole and organic in character. It cannot be entirely divorced from the life and philosophy of the poet. The relation between poetry and philosophy is very complex, and the solution to this problem is not simple. His theory can be called the impersonal theory of poetry. He was against Wordsworth and Coleridge because of their theory of emotions and their view that poetry was an expression of personality. He explained his own theory in his essay, Tradition and Individual Talent. No real poet stands for or by himself. The value of a poet lies in the fact that other great poets of the past speak through him. All existing masterpieces of literature from a composite whole for an idea form. Every new work corresponds to this order and at the same time alters it to some extent. This alteration is done in the spirit of the tradition without introducing a note of discord. Taking Europe, for example, Eliot points out that there was such a thing as the common mind of Europe and the mind of his own country, which a good critic cannot ignore. The past lives in the present, and the present will not be complete without an awareness of the past. It is here that Eliot introduced his theory of impersonal poetry, depersonalization. The poet surrenders totally to something valuable. His mind becomes a receptacle for storing up feelings, words, and images. His mind is just a medium in which they enter into a combination which fits into the archetype value of the past. In this process, thought and feeling fuse, and one could almost feel the thoughts of a poet like Donne. Since the time of Donne, thoughts and the feelings associated with it and vice versa were conveyed together without separation by the metaphysical poets. Eliot tried to restore this tradition and find a place in literary criticism for sensitiveness, learning sense of history and tradition and generalization power. Any good poet lived in a tradition and so must surrender himself to it. This act of surrender makes him impersonal, and his poetic emotion becomes free from the bias of personal subjectivity. This leads to a necessity for order subject onto the past judgment of history and an objective standard of values. No poet can get on without allegiance to something outside himself. Mere reliance on personal inspiration or inner voice must be rejected. The true critic must thus conform to certain common laws and principles found in his tradition. It is important to examine his view of tradition because it is an important part of his theory of poetry and criticism. No poet or any artist can be correctly judged without the background of tradition. Tradition and the new poet interact with and judge each other and are mutually related. Thus, tradition becomes a dynamic influence and helps the artist to be aware of main currents of art and poetry in the past. The past of the present therefore form a harmonious whole in his mind, and he is always aware of one through the other. Eliot's theory of poetry demands considerable learning and vital understanding of the past. It is not mere pedantry. There was no place for new emotions of eccentricity in his theory of poetry. A poet must take ordinary emotion common through humanity and transform them into poetry in the light of his past tradition. He must be passive instrument and medium through which the poetic process takes shape. As a classist, Eliot emphasized the value of tradition and authority and was against pure individual inspiration, which was free from all authority. Mere inspiration or inner voice is not the final arbiter in poetry or criticism. Thus, Eliot was against the romantic tradition in art. Criticism and creation are of great help to each other. Creation itself involves much critical labor of analyzing, selecting, and rejecting. On the other hand, critically creative critically activity need not involve creation. There is no such thing as creative criticism because the function of criticism is to help the poet in the process of composition. The sense of fact and history are important for criticism. A good critic comprises and analyzes a work of art and arrives at genuine interpretation. Personal factors and opinions are vigorously kept out. Thus, scholarship in any form of is of great value to a masterly critic. To Eliot, despite the wider canons adopted, criticism could never be a self suffering activity. Criticism has functions beyond interpretation because a critic is to act as corrector of tastes and he cannot remain purely liberty. A critic must be a whole man aware of the artistic, the religious, the political, and the social and spiritual aspect of life. At the same time, criticism should not become wholly devoted to one of these aspects of life. It is a literary activity in a sense, but such activity is carried on in the context of other aspect of life. It must make use of the other field of study and it should not become a particular study. It must take use of all disciplines without itself turning into one of them. Finally, Eliot believed that the best criticism comes from a poet judging his own poetry. The view has its own restrictions in the cause of poets whose knowledge of history and tradition is not great. He was a classist, anti romantic, and anti humanist. This was, a, this was his limitation. The romantic approach to reality has its own validity and is based on intuitions and intimations received in a state of deep passivity. It is a proper antidote to a mere classical approach. Classicism has its own epistemological limitations because of its insistence on order, pattern, and norm. It is valuable, of course, but imposes its own special restrictions on our approach to reality. In modern times, the world is becoming sick of the classical and rational attitudes and turning to romantic and initiative religions for meaning and consolation. The romantic element is a part of human nature and has its own great value in work of art in dealing with reality. Despite these limitations, Eliot can be considered a great critic of his age. His great contribution was to compel the critics to accept tradition as an important factor. He put an end to certain fragmentary schools of criticism. It can be said that he is the Aristotle of the modern literary criticism. His anti romanticism was due to the fear that uncontrolled emotion might lead to chaos in literature. So, thanks for watching.